Welcome to English Stories Cube. Today, we're going to talk about one of the most mysterious and one of the most fascinating figures in history. His name is D.B. Cooper. You may have heard his name before. Maybe you know about the man who hijacked a plane, asked for ransom, and then disappeared into the sky without a trace. But do you know the full story? Do you know what really happened on that night? And how he managed to vanish forever? Today, we will explore the hijacking, the escape, the investigation, and the mystery that still remains unsolved even today. Let's begin. Part 1. A normal Wednesday. A normal flight. A man with a briefcase. It was November 24th, 1971, the day before Thanksgiving in America. One of the busiest travel days of the year. Airports were full. Families were going home. Everyone was thinking about turkey, warmth, and holiday celebrations. Nobody was thinking about crime. At Portland International Airport in Oregon, a man walked up to the ticket counter. He was calm. He was quiet. He was completely ordinary looking. He wore a dark business suit, a black tie with a small pearl pin, dark sunglasses. He carried a black briefcase. He bought a one-way ticket. Cash. The flight was Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 305. Destination, Seattle, Washington. A short flight. Less than 1 hour. He gave his name as Dan Cooper. Nobody paid attention to him. Why would they? He looked like 100 other businessmen traveling that day. Middle-aged. Average height, average build, nothing remarkable about him at all. He boarded the plane. He took his seat, 18C, an aisle seat toward the back of the plane. He ordered a bourbon and soda. He waited. The plane took off. And then, about 30 minutes into the flight, Dan Cooper did something that nobody on that plane expected. He passed a note to the flight attendant sitting nearest to him. Her name was Florence Schaffner. Florence thought he was passing her his phone number. Men did that sometimes. She put the note in her pocket without reading it. Cooper leaned toward her quietly. "Miss," he said calmly, "you had better look at that note. I have a bomb." Florence Schaffner looked at him. Then she took out the note and read it. Her face went pale. The note said he had a bomb in his briefcase. He wanted $200,000 in cash. He wanted 4 parachutes, 2 primary, 2 reserve. He wanted a fuel truck ready in Seattle to refuel the plane. If his demands are not met, he would blow up the plane. Florence walked to the cockpit and told the pilots. The most extraordinary hijacking in American history had begun. Part 2. The negotiation. A man who knew exactly what he was doing. The pilots immediately radioed Seattle-Tacoma Airport and passed the information to the authorities on the ground. The FBI was called. Airline executives were called. Law enforcement scrambled. And everyone noticed the same thing immediately. This man knew what he was doing. Most hijackers in that era, and there were many hijackings in the late 1960s and early 1970s, were disorganized, emotional, and irrational. They made impossible demands. They panicked. They made mistakes. Dan Cooper was none of these things. His demands were specific and realistic. $200,000 was a large amount, but not an impossible amount for an airline to gather quickly. For parachutes was an unusual request, but not impossible. He was not asking for a private jet to Cuba or for the release of political prisoners. He was asking for things that could actually be provided. He was calm, eerily calm. He sipped his bourbon. He chatted politely with the flight attendants. He was not rude. He was not threatening in his manner, only in his words. He knew aviation. The questions he asked, the things he knew about the plane, the way he understood refueling procedures and flight routes. This was not a random person. This was someone with knowledge of how planes worked. The authorities on the ground made a decision quickly. They would cooperate. They would get the money. They would get the parachutes. They would not risk the lives of the passengers and crew. The plane circled Seattle for 2 hours while everything was arranged. The FBI gathered $200,000 in cash, 10,000 $20 bills. Importantly, they photographed every single bill and recorded every serial number. If these bills ever appeared anywhere, in a bank, in a store, anywhere, they would know. For parachutes were obtained. When everything was ready, Flight 305 landed in Seattle. Cooper allowed all 36 passengers to leave the plane. He kept the crew, the pilots, the flight engineers, and 2 flight attendants. The money was brought on board in a bag. The parachutes were brought on board. Cooper examined the money briefly. He examined the parachutes. He was satisfied. He told the pilots his next instructions. "We're going to fly to Mexico City," he said, "but we will fly low, no higher than 10,000 feet, and slow, no faster than 150 knots. And the landing gear stays down, and the cabin will not be pressurized." The pilots told him this would require a fuel stop. The plane could not make it to Mexico City under those conditions without refueling. "Reno, Nevada," Cooper said. "We stop in Reno." The pilots agreed. The plane took off from Seattle at 7:40 p.m. It was dark outside. The weather was terrible. Rain, wind, cold, a storm moving through the Pacific Northwest. And somewhere over the wilderness of southwest Washington state, Dan Cooper disappeared. Part 3. The Jump into the Storm, into the Dark. Somewhere between 8 p.m. and 8:30 p.m., something happened to the back of the plane. The flight attendants had been instructed by Cooper to stay in the front of the plane and not come to the rear. The cockpit crew were flying the plane. Nobody was watching Cooper. The pilots noticed something on their instruments. A pressure change at the back of the plane. A change that meant only one thing. The rear staircase of a Boeing 727. A unique feature of that aircraft. A staircase that could be lowered and opened during flight from inside the plane had been opened. Cooper had jumped into the dark, into the rain, into a storm, into the wilderness of the Pacific Northwest. At night, in November, with $200,000 strapped to his body and a parachute on his back. When the plane landed in Reno, Nevada, the rear staircase was still down. Cooper's black tie and his pearl tie pin were on the seat where he had been sitting. 2 of the parachutes were still on the plane. He had taken only 2. Dan Cooper was gone. The FBI launched the largest manhunt in American history at that point. Hundreds of agents, military search teams, civilian volunteers. They searched the wilderness of southwest Washington, the area where Cooper most likely jumped, for weeks. They found nothing. No parachute, no body, no bag of money, no footprints, no campfire. No sign that any human being had landed in that wilderness. Dan Cooper had vanished as completely as if he had never existed. Part 4. The Investigation. 45 years and no answer. The FBI opened what became their longest-running investigation in history. They called it NORJAC, Northwest Hijacking. Over the following decades, they interviewed thousands of people. They followed thousands of leads. They investigated hundreds of suspects. Every few years, someone would come forward with new information. A relative who thought their family member might be Cooper. A deathbed confession. A new piece of evidence. A new theory. Every single lead, every single one, eventually went nowhere. But there were some fascinating moments along the way. The money. In February 1980, nearly 9 years after the hijacking, a young boy named Brian Ingram was on a family picnic on the banks of the Columbia River in Washington State. He was digging in the sandy riverbank, the way children do. He found something strange, old, rotting. He pulled it out. It was a bundle of $20 bills, decayed, falling apart, held together barely by rubber bands that had long since rotted away. But the serial numbers were still readable. The FBI checked the numbers. It was Cooper's money. A portion of the ransom, $5,800, had been found on the riverbank. This was the only physical evidence ever recovered from the entire case. But it raised more questions than it answered. How did the money get there? Had Cooper buried it and it washed downstream over 9 years? Had he died in the jump and his body and the money washed into the river? Had he deliberately planted it? Nobody knew. The rest of the money, $194,200, has never been found. The suspects. Over the years, many suspects were investigated seriously. Richard McCoy, a man who hijacked another plane in almost exactly the same way just a few months after Cooper in 1972. He also parachuted from a plane with ransom money. He was caught, arrested, and eventually killed in a prison escape. Many people believe McCoy and Cooper were the same person. The FBI investigated seriously, but ultimately concluded they were two different men, partly because McCoy's appearance did not match witness descriptions of Cooper. Dwayne Weber, a man whose wife came forward after his death in 1995 to say that on his deathbed, he had whispered to her, "I am Dan Cooper." She found evidence that seemed to support this. Old plane ticket stubs, a library book about the Cooper hijacking with handwriting in the margins, a knee injury consistent with a parachute landing. The FBI investigated. They could not confirm or deny. L.D. Cooper, a man whose niece came forward in 2011 claiming her uncle had confessed to her. She brought DNA evidence. The FBI tested it. Inconclusive. There were others. Many others. Pilots. Soldiers. Criminals. Ordinary men living ordinary lives whose families suspected they might secretly be the most famous hijacker in history. None were ever proven to be Dan Cooper. Part 5. The name. Where did D.B. Cooper come from? Here is an interesting detail that most people do not know. The hijacker gave his name as Dan Cooper. D.B. Cooper, the name the whole world knows, was actually a mistake made by a journalist. In the early hours of the investigation, a reporter heard police radio communications that mentioned a man named D.B. Cooper who was being investigated as a possible associate or lead. This D.B. Cooper was a completely different person, a man with a criminal record who had nothing to do with the hijacking and was quickly cleared. But the reporter used the name D.B. Cooper in their news report, and it stuck. The whole world picked it up. D.B. Cooper. The name spread across America and around the world. By the time anyone realized the mistake, it was too late. The hijacker's real name, whatever it was, has never been discovered. Even the name Dan Cooper that he gave the ticket counter was almost certainly false. He remains the only person in American aviation history to successfully hijack a commercial aircraft and never be caught or identified. Part 6. Could he have survived? This is the question that everyone asks. Could a man really parachute from a plane at night, in a storm, over wilderness in November, and survive? The experts are divided. Those who say no point to the conditions. The temperature outside the plane at 10,000 feet that night was around -7 degrees Celsius. He was wearing a business suit, not cold weather gear. The terrain below was dense forest, rivers, and mountains. Extremely dangerous landing territory, even in perfect conditions. At night, in a storm, he could not see where he was going. He had no way to steer towards safety. They also point out that he took a non-steerable military parachute, not the modern, maneuverable type. He could not guide himself. He was at the mercy of the wind and the dark. The search teams who looked for him concluded that if he had landed in that wilderness in those conditions, dressed as he was, he would have been dead from hypothermia within hours, even if the landing itself did not kill him. Those who say yes point to the fact that no body was ever found. No parachute, no bones, nothing. If he died in the wilderness, where did he go? Animals, weather, and time might explain the absence of remains, but it still feels incomplete. They also point to his apparent expertise. A man who planned this carefully, who knew the plane, who knew parachutes, who gave himself the best possible chance, might have also planned his landing zone carefully, might have known the area, might have had help waiting, and they point to the money on the riverbank. If Cooper died in the wilderness, how did the money end up on the Columbia River, which was not in the primary search area, and which was downstream from where anyone expected him to land? The truth is, nobody knows if Dan Cooper lived or died. Part 7. The Legend, America's Most Beloved Criminal. Something strange happened to Dan Cooper over the decades. He became a folk hero. Americans, who are sometimes suspicious of authority and have a romantic relationship with the idea of the clever outlaw, fell in love with the story. Here was a man who had outsmarted an entire airline, the FBI, and the United States government. He had taken his money and disappeared into thin air. Whether he lived or died, he had won. T-shirts were made. Songs were written. Books were published. Films were made. Every year, in the small town of Ariel, Washington, the closest town to where Cooper likely jumped, there is an annual D.B. Cooper Festival. People dress up as Cooper. They celebrate his memory. They debate theories about who he really was. The FBI officially closed the active investigation in 2016, 45 years after the hijacking, citing a need to redirect resources. But they said they would still accept credible physical evidence if it came forward. The case is officially inactive, but it is not officially solved. Dan Cooper remains wanted, unknown, unfound. Part 8. The theories. Who is he really? After 50 years, dozens of serious theories exist about who Dan Cooper really was. The military theory. Cooper had knowledge of parachutes, planes, and the Pacific Northwest terrain. Many investigators believe he was a former military man, possibly a paratrooper or special forces soldier who had extensive parachute experience. The Vietnam War was ongoing in 1971. Thousands of trained soldiers were returning home. Some were struggling. Some were desperate. The insider theory. Cooper knew too much about the Boeing 727, specifically the rear staircase, which was not widely known to the public. Some believe he worked in the aviation industry, a mechanic, a ground crew member, someone who had access to and knowledge of aircraft. The local theory, the money found on the Columbia River, suggests Cooper may have known the local geography very well. He may have been from the Pacific Northwest. He may have had a specific landing zone in mind, somewhere near water, somewhere he could move quickly after landing. The escape theory. Some believe Cooper did not act alone, that someone was waiting for him on the ground. A car, a boat, a safe house, a partner who helped him disappear completely. The death theory. The simplest theory. He jumped. He died. His body was consumed by the wilderness over time. The money washed into the river. There is no mystery. Just a man who took an enormous risk and lost. No one knows which theory is correct. Perhaps no one ever will. The final thought. Dan Cooper bought a plane ticket with cash. He wore a suit and sunglasses. He ordered a bourbon. He passed a note. He jumped into a storm. And then he was gone. He left behind a black tie, a pearl tie pin, a set of fingerprints that matched no one in any database, and $5,800 in rotting bills on a riverbank. He left behind no name, no face, no grave, no answer. For 50 years, the most powerful law enforcement agency in the world, the FBI, tried to find him. They failed. He remains the only successful air pirate in American history. The only hijacker who was never caught, never identified, never explained. Was he a desperate man? A brilliant criminal? A trained soldier? A ghost? We do not know. We may never know. And perhaps, like Atlantis, like El Dorado, like all the great mysteries of human history, that is exactly the point. Some questions are not meant to be answered. Some people are not meant to be found. Dan Cooper jumped into the dark, into the storm, into the unknown, and the dark kept his secret. Thank you for reading today's easy English listening practice. You did a great job. Keep reading, keep listening, keep learning, because every great story is waiting for you.